marathons through the Sahara Desert. The race takes place over 6 days, and competitors have to take all of their own supplies to last them the entire race. And on top of that, they have to pay $5,500 to compete. During the day, the temperatures in this desert can reach 50 degrees Celsius. There's also a race called the Dragon's Back Race, which takes place along the mountainous spine of Wales. This race is 380 kilometers, and it includes a 17,400 meter ascent, which is twice the height of Mount Everest. The race also takes 6 days to complete. There's another race called the Mountain Lapland Arctic Ultra, which is a 500-kilometer race through Sweden. Part of the race takes the competitors across the Arctic Circle several times. Due to the location and the time of the year when the race takes place, most of the racing happens in darkness and in freezing temperatures. There's also the Spartathlon in Greece, which is a 246-kilometer race between Athens and Sparta, inspired by the Greek legend of Phidippides, who was an Athenian messenger who ran between Athens and Sparta to seek help against the Persians in the Battle of Marathon. Competitors have 36 hours to cover 246 kilometers, and they must reach 75 checkpoints at specific time intervals throughout the race to continue racing. So if you're a runner, you may find such races appealing. If you're not, you may find the people who choose to participate in them peculiar and incomprehensible. However, even though I could never imagine about thinking of running through a desert or the Arctic Circle or for tens or hundreds of hours, I can understand that some people would be deeply motivated by not only the challenge of the race, but also by the accomplishment of having completed such grueling events. In the New Testament, Paul used the analogy of running a race to convey more clearly the experience of the Christian journey towards eternal life. In 2 Timothy 4:7, as Paul's earthly life was coming to an end, he wrote, "I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith." And in Galatians 5:7, he wrote, "You were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth?" I suppose it's a clever analogy because it withstood the test of time. Foot races have continued to exist from the time of Paul's letters until today. And although the specifics of racings have changed, the essence of it hasn't. So that means that when Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 9:24, "Do you not know that all those who run a race run, but one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it," we are able to grasp the meaning he was trying to convey to his original audience. In Hebrews 12:1, Paul made another reference to the Christian life as a race. Immediately preceding this verse, Paul had demonstrated the power of faith in the lives of numerous known and unknown Christians. Woven throughout chapter 11 were not only the great feats these individuals had accomplished, but also their success in securing a good testimony through faith that ensured their eternal life. Following faith's hall of fame, Paul then admonished his readers with the analogy of the race by saying, "Therefore, since we are encompassed with such a great cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, That is Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1. Paul knew his original audience would be prompted to think of the ancient Greek running races as they read his words. Greek races were incredibly popular at the time and were akin to the modern-day Olympics. And thus, competitors took these events very seriously due to the prestige of the race and the immense value of the prize. For you see, ancient Greeks believed that by winning events such as running races, they could achieve immortality. And consequently, races did not simply turn up on the day of the race, but they prepared long in advance in order to ensure their success. Being a Greek athlete required extreme discipline because the prize was invaluable. And Paul drew on these elements of ancient Greek races in verse 1 and identified two key elements to running the race towards eternal life victoriously. The first aspect is a preparatory element. Paul warned his readers that they needed to make the necessary preparations to meet the demands of the race. Ancient Greek runners would compete naked, concerned that any article of clothing would hinder their pace or cause them to trip, thus compromising their chances to win the prize. Paul drew on this fact when he wrote, "Lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily entangles us." The Hebrew readers would have understood that every weight meant anything, just as the ancient Greek athletes would discard even the loincloths prior to the races. There was nothing the Hebrews should hold on to if it was going to interfere with their ability to run the race. Nothing on this earth was worth losing the race to eternity. Nothing. The readers of the book of Hebrews were languishing, they were tired and were worn down by the challenges they were encountering, and they were at risk of letting the weights that they were carrying from jeopardizing their victory. Many people today are languishing the same way the Hebrews were. After exiting a 2-year pandemic, we've entered a war in Eastern Europe that some commentators warn could go on for years. Politicians are speaking of the nuclear threat posed by the war, while various other bodies are warning the world of an impending food shortage. So long as Ukraine and Russia are at war, the rest of the world remains in a state of economic and military unrest. Perhaps you are fortunate enough and neither the pandemic nor the current war in Europe has weighed you down. But perhaps life itself is weighing you down. Life, with its responsibilities, its distractions, its losses, its problems, its joys. It can trick us into believing that some of those things are essential weights that we must carry on our journey. Some of those things, the responsibilities, the distractions, the losses, the problems, the joys, they are important or even necessary for our earthly journey. One must work to eat. One must provide for their family and enjoy the blessings God bestows upon us. However, when these things weigh us down, then it is time to let them go. No achievement or problem on earth is worth eternal life. We are to heed Paul's admonition and carefully examine what aspects of our lives are weighing us down, slowing down our spiritual life, and commit to discard them, just as the ancient Greek runners discarded every item of clothing prior to the race. Once we have let go of the weights that are slowing us down, Paul's next instruction was to turn our attention to sin. Paul describes sin in this passage as the sin which so easily entangles us. While there are things that weigh us down and slow our progress, Sin traps us. It trips us up. Holding on to sin can have catastrophic consequences for our race. Have you ever seen a runner trip as they were racing? It seldom ends well for the race. The way Paul describes sin in this verse reminds me of a pair of pants I had with belt loops that would frequently get caught on various things, especially as I was walking past doorways or door handles. So I would be walking along and suddenly I would feel this strong tug. And once again, I was entangled, as it were, unable to keep on walking until I unhooked myself from the door. Every time it happened, I would think, I must remember that this happens when I'm wearing these pants. And yet, that did not seem to stop it from happening again. I experience sin so similarly. I can be happily on my journey when suddenly I find myself entangled, unable to continue moving forward. And I think, oh man, how did this happen again? It happens because sin is like the belt loops on those pants, ready to catch us out and stop us on our tracks. What is interesting is that Paul wrote that we need to lay aside sin. There is no sense that sin is out to get us along the course like some secret obstacle, but rather that we carry it with us. We are entangled by the sin we refuse to let go of. Perhaps we have been carrying a particular sin for such a long time that we believe we know how to handle it to prevent it from getting us tripped up. But heed Paul's warning. Sin, any sin, all sin, will, sooner or later, entangle us. We cannot fool ourselves. If we refuse to let go of any sin, we will likely find ourselves entangled by it time and time again. And each time we fall, we risk losing the ability to get back up, to rejoin the race, to reach the finishing line. The race is too important to let anything, whatever it may be, stop you from reaching the finishing line. Victory depends on it. Lay all sin at the foot of the cross. Once a Christian has made the necessary preparations, Paul turned to another aspect of the race. The second aspect required to successfully complete the race is a perfective one. Paul encouraged his readers to run with endurance. Paul's words clearly convey that the race towards eternal life will not be easy, and that victory will come to those who persevere. As I mentioned before, the letter to the Hebrews was intended to be read by Christians who were demoralized by the struggles they were facing. They were still running the race, but they were losing their stamina. They were at risk of quitting, and so Paul encouraged them to keep on running. Perhaps you feel similar to the Hebrews. Perhaps you have been running the race for a while and you are growing weary. The finishing line is not within sight, and you wonder if you're on track for the prize. Perhaps you believe that because the race is such a struggle, there is something wrong. You may think that these things should be easier, less painful, less agonizing, less arduous. But consider how Paul described the Christian journey. A race set before us. Races are not random routes the runners take. A race course is planned ahead of time by the organizer. This person will plan the best route, consider the degree of difficulty of the course, the challenges the runners will encounter, the designated end point, and clearly signal the route the runner should take. A runner does not take part in a race unless the course has been charted ahead of time. Similarly, the spiritual race that is set before us has been carefully planned by a God who loves us and who wants us to obtain the promised prize. The struggle is not a sign that there is something wrong with the race or that you are on the wrong path. Olympic races are hard. Athletes are expected to give their all to win. The race is hard, yes, but the price is worth it. If you're struggling, if you're finding the race difficult, do not think that you need to find a different course, a different race. Trust the one who has charted the course. Persevere, continue running with endurance. Victory through Christ will one day be yours. Keep running towards the finishing line. Keep running until you win the prize. And when you get tired, which you will, look around you. Paul began Hebrews 12 with the reason why we ought to run the race by writing, "Therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses." Fully embracing the Olympic metaphor, Paul encouraged his readers to think of themselves as competing in a stadium with an audience around them. This audience consists of no ordinary people. These spectators are the great heroes of faith Paul identified in Hebrews 11, the great competitors in the spiritual race who have reached the finishing line and are waiting to receive their eternal prize. When things become hard, it is easy to become discouraged, to believe that the task is impossible. But that is when Paul tells us to look around. Look into the audience, and you will see Noah, who for 120 years preached a message that made no sense whatsoever, as he spoke of an impending disaster and built an artifact that was meant to save humans and animals from something called a flood. Look around, and you will see Abraham, who trusted God to do the impossible, to give a single man a land inhabited by mighty armies, to give him a child in his old age, to raise this child from the dead, even though there was no record that anyone had been resurrected before. Look around, and you will see Rahab, who believed an unknown God would be faithful to a prostitute who wanted to serve him. Look up, and you will see Moses, who abandoned his royal privileges and spent 80 years wandering in a desert, learning to trust God. The same Moses that, despite his selfless service to a stubborn and rebellious nation, persevered in his journey towards the promised land, and who at the border of entering the place he had in his vision his whole life, he accepted God's decision not to let him enter. Look up, and you will see David, who experienced an incomprehensible moral meltdown, or Samson, whose love of women enslaved him. Yet both men serve as witnesses that God can forgive any sin that is confessed. Look up, and you will also see countless martyrs who through the ages gave up the earthly lives while singing hymns of praise. These individuals are there to encourage us, to teach us, to remind us that the race can be won, that the reward awaits all who reach the finishing line. If you're tired of running the race, if you feel discouraged by the fact that you cannot see the finishing line, if you are considering giving up, look up at the great heroes of faith. Study the lives of those who have successfully run the race before us and learn from them. Let their lives inspire you to keep running. Don't give up. The reward is coming. But there is one more key Paul offered his weary readers in order to run the race successfully. And this is found in verse 2 of Hebrews chapter 12, where Paul wrote, "Looking unto Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith." Jesus is the key to claiming the prize. While we are to do everything within our power to prepare ourselves to run, and we are to persevere until we cross the finishing line, A victory will only be gained because of Jesus. And there's two main reasons for this. The first one is that Jesus himself ran the ultimate race and he was victorious. When Jesus came to earth to live like us, yet remained faithful to God, even unto death, he overcame the claim Satan had over humanity. His sinless life and selfless sacrifice has secured our eternal prize. Through faith, we can obtain the promise of eternal life. And by following Christ's example, we can rest assured that we remain on the charted course, irrespective of the challenges we encounter along the way, because he has gone before us. There's a poem by J.D. Smith that encaptures this idea. It says, "Dark is the sky and veiled the unknown morrow. Dark is life's way, for night is not yet over. The longed-for glimpse I may not meanwhile borrow. By this I know, he goeth on before. Dangers are nigh, and fears my mind are shaking. Heart seems to dread what life may hold in store. But I am his, he knows the way I'm taking. More blessed still, he goeth on before. Doubts cast their weird, unwelcome shadows over me. Doubts that life's best, life's choicest things are over. What but his word can strengthen, can restore me, and this blessed fact that still he goes before. He goes before, be this my consolation. He goes before, on this my heart would dwell. He goes before, this guarantees salvation. He goes before, and therefore all is well. Not only do we have the assurance that he goes before us, but there is a second reason Jesus is the key to succeeding in this race. And that is because Jesus is the author and the finisher of our faith. In Hebrews 11, Paul clearly expanded his thesis that all victories that those historical figures experienced, whether temporal or spiritual, were due to faith. Paul explained that through faith, the walls of Jericho fell down, kingdoms were subdued, promises were obtained, the mouths of lions were stopped. Some escaped the edge of the sword, some became valiant in battle, and some were raised to life again. Yet others, through faith, were stoned, were sawn in two, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They were destitute, afflicted, tormented. All these, the ones who were victorious and the ones who endured unto death, did these things through faith. Yet in Hebrews 12, Paul clarified that the incredible faith these individuals demonstrated did not come from within them, but originated from God and was perfected by God. For you see, there is nothing we can do in our power, least of all attain salvation. That is why Paul implored his readers to look to Jesus. For only Jesus, who began a good work in us, will complete it. Jesus, and only Jesus. Ancient Greek athletes were willing to make any sacrifice to compete in running events because they knew there was a prize awaiting them at the end of the race. And that prize was more valuable than anything else they could attain on this earth. It was this knowledge that motivated them to give it their all and not to let anything distract them from crossing the finishing line. We too should have this sheer determination not to let anything prevent us from persevering on this race we're on. Not to let anything distract us from keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus. Absolutely nothing is worth the loss of our eternal prize. Don't give up. Don't get distracted. Keep moving forward. Look to Jesus, the originator of our faith. Look to Jesus, the perfecter of our faith. Look to Jesus, our example in how to run the race. Look to Jesus, the promise of our reward.